Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer SS&C Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, or best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to see how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Marchuk. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. On today's episode, we have a special guest, Nirav Patel. Nirav is the CEO of Bristlecone, a leading provider of AI-powered supply chain services. And today we'll be talking a lot more about AI and its application in the supply chain, which a lot of companies have found some issues with over the past couple of years, as you might imagine. So welcome, Nirav.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Oh, I'm glad you're here. So tell us a little bit more about yourself and how your background got you into supply chain.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Just a little bit about us as a company. We are a leading provider of AI-powered app transformation services for the connected supply chain. We deliver end-to-end services, industry-specific solutions across many global 2,000 customers. That includes industrial, manufacturing, retail, consumer, life sciences, as well as technology clients. We have 14 global hubs with over 2,600 employees. We are among the top 10 global supply chain providers. We are part of a $19.4 billion Mahindra Group, which is one of the largest conglomerate that has businesses spanning auto, farm, technology, finance, as well as real estate and many other businesses around it. Telling you a little bit about myself, I spent, over 2 decades solving what I call a business critical technology problems, solving them in a way that has had profound impact on various industries. I think one of the things that has always driven me as a passion is staying focused on how can you really solve real world business problems by using the technology tools that you have available at your disposal. So I spent over 20 years as part of Cognizant, building one of the largest system integrator firm in that, played many roles throughout my career with them. I decided to step down in 2019 and into this president and CEO role during the fun times of COVID.
Supply chain was front and center at that point, right?
Absolutely. I was like looking at my background and me parking myself on the side, enjoying I call me time and family time. I felt that, hey, what a way to really enter back. My first ever transition, my first ever CEO job, and transitioning that as a virtual CEO, because I never got to meet my teams for, I think, about 9 or 10 months because we were all in the lockdown. So dealing as a virtual CEO was interesting discussion by itself to really think and talk about it in terms of how do you really go through an onboarding and joining as a CEO when you're not meeting people in person.
Yeah, that had to be hard. So we look at the changes that COVID brought on, and with the global supply chain becoming as complex as it has, and this has been for the past 10, 15, 20 years now, you've seen it get more and more complex and more globalized. How are traditional organizations able to keep up with this?
I'll say this, the traditional organizations, and I'll give a little direct answer in this scenario, that I think there is a clear shortage of what I call talent. And there is not a shortage of the technology advancements or the tools. And I think the whole AI world, it's only proliferated in a place that you have more assets, more tools, more technology at your disposal. And the challenge for most traditional enterprises has been their ability to adopt them. And I think this whole notion that I always feel that be an adopter before an innovator. I think this whole idea that a lot of enterprises focus on saying, we got to be the best innovator and we got to be the best in inventing the technology. But I think an even more powerful way to think about large organizations is saying, can you be the best adopter of what's available out there? Because we know for sure that the technology tools and assets are so meaningfully available out there. And the biggest challenge our customers and large enterprises really face is in their ability to have a talent base that understands business problems and can really tie with some of the greatest technology tools and assets that are available in the form of AI, cloud, and so forth.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like the idea of just let's use what we have out there because we can certainly learn from other companies who've done this already and at least catch up to where they are and then become innovative once we really understand and how to go forward that. Um, we talk about your services related to the AI powered supply chain and demand planning. Seems like it's a great way to apply machine learning because these systems have a natural feedback loop to them. In demand management application, the system is continuously monitoring forecasting accuracy and whatnot. That accuracy in the system allows for the system, the whole learning feedback loop to happen. But what are the challenges related to applying AI and ML to the supply side of planning?
I would say that, look, first of all, we have to come to a realization and acceptance of the problem statement in a way that in the whole flat world that we went ourselves into in the last decade or so, your problems are less within the boundaries of your organization. Your problems are a lot more when you're trying to deal outside the boundaries of your organization. And when you now overlay that problem where it crosses borders and it crosses countries and it crosses places where there are macro issues and geopolitical tensions, you're trying to deal with harmonizing an ability for you to really deploy technology to provide fundamentally this level of visibility and transparency for you to be able to take quicker actions. And most planners on the supply side aren't really when they actually know where the problem are. Like the visibility part, in my opinion, I think one of the stuff that we really constantly keep pushing is installing visibility systems that give them access and view to those things. Now, you cannot just deploy a system and actually allow, for example, most regulations don't demand a buyer or a buyer of a set of products or services that come from different suppliers to really track beyond their first year of network. And you really think about this, I call vertical disintegration that has happened. You take an example of a laptop or a PC that gets no longer are the days that every part that goes into a laptop is all made in one firm. You really have specialists that actually make hard disk, and there are special players that makes chips, and there are others that actually makes the memories. And all of them are globally distributed in many parts of the world. So you really think about a supplier ecosystem and you're trying to solve technology, or you're trying to solve the problem on the supplier side by using technology to solve ecosystem problems. No longer you're trying to solve a vendor, supplier, buyer, partner ecosystem, right? So it's a fundamental shift that if you need to really meaningfully solve, and there are the last 3 years in the post-COVID world has seen disproportionate amount of venture money that has gone in supply chain tech startups. And I would say that almost 70 or 80% of them have tried to solve the ecosystem problem. They've actually built SaaS products because they feel that there is a smarter way to know if you can have an ecosystem way to really track progress, or at least sense where you're going to have some geopolitical tensions or regulatory issues or natural calamity issues or responding to those scenarios. Then I think you can be smarter in actually solving. So I think it's a real problem in terms of knowing that are you solving for your own set of vendors and partners, or are you really solving for an ecosystem? And I think organizations that take a broader view of trying to first think about the ecosystem and saying, hey, there will be players that will not be our partners, but they could play a role in actually helping you change your sourcing strategies on the fly, you know? And for you to be able to change a sourcing strategy on the fly, you need to be able to spot an issue in one part of the chain, right? Like the Suez Canal issues that we've had, which had to go into a trouble where nothing was available. So what's the alternate routes available? Sometimes you actually don't have a lot of alternate options because you're constrained by the channels that these suppliers ships their products through. So I think, in my opinion, you have to really anchor yourself as an ecosystem thought leader and say that, hey, if I solve for the whole supplier ecosystem, and that might very well include players that are no longer, they are not part of my supplier base, but maybe they are my competitor supplier base, then I think you actually get to a more powerful and impactful way to solving something which is a little bit more permanent rather than just trying to address a specific event.
Yeah, it makes sense. That makes sense. So when you introduce AI or any kind of technology within an organization, oftentimes that technology is a black box. AI does some magic behind the scenes, especially when it comes to forecasting. How did this come about? What's the algorithm doing behind the scenes here? And when you use machine learning, obviously it's truly learning from the data. It's reviewing and validating these kind of things, but it can also force these planners to blindly trust in those outputs. How can you overcome those kind of concerns when you're applying AI in this environment?
That's a very interesting problem, Michael. And I'm going to take a stab at trying to give you an answer my way. And I'm not necessarily sure if that's the right answer for it, because I feel that's a journey. Because what you're addressing or what you're trying to really pose is true subtleness in this. We understand completely and we got the idea that data is the new air or the oxygen, if you will, for the AI systems to work. That's very well clearly understood. And so your machine models, your modelings are learning and training themselves on a constant basis. And how you as individuals can trust, whereas in the past, you use data, you use systems to give you an insight and you actually made the decision. And now you're actually having your AI models tell you the decision and telling you to just execute. Yeah. And in many cases, when you go into an autonomous mode, you're also seeing them execute by itself. So you're trying to really jump yourself into that conversation. And I feel you solve this in two different ways. I think there is a human aspects that one has to solve, and which is why while the world is going through what I call AI transition, and one of the CEOs I recently met at the Davos Summit talked about this as human transitions. That along with that AI transitions, you need the transition of the attitude and the humans, and they have to be really be able to embrace this smart machine answers and say, I think that is merited in me giving that a shot and seeing whether it really does. Usually humans tend to feel good whenever there is a level of trust established. It's no different than a manager asking their subordinate for the best judgment that the subordinate has. And when the planner on as a subordinate just tells the manager saying, hey, I think this is the best way to solve it. When you have a trust, they actually take that answer and saying, okay, let's execute towards that. And so now you replace this with a machine that's going to tell you an answer or is telling you an answer. And an example scenarios, I feel in many ways, when you start building that level of trust between humans and machines, I think you really get over what I call this hurdle of human transitions. And how do you get the humans to really start trusting and believing the systems and their answer to be the best, or at least the best in their own judgments, like the way you do it with any other humans, right? So I feel that's an important transition. A lot of our clients are continuing to push the envelope. We from Bristlecone are fundamentally a talent business. We are all about people. And we are saying that we are not necessarily trying to solve it by just having people solve it the old way, but people and humans solving the new way, which is along with the machines, is the best way to actually think about solving in the future. And I think this is the best I call an archetype of how you would want the organizations of the future to be for. Because if you don't have people who are believing and trusting the system, you almost get to a point where you don't know how to solve it. The recent challenge we saw with one of the airlines having all the flights to be canceled on a massive, seemed to be a little bit of a system failure. Now, the problem is we go into an autonomous mode to a level where your system is almost deciding, rerouting everything and planning themselves, that it lands itself in a little bit of a deadlock that now you need the human intervention to really get it out of it, because it spiraled itself into a completely wrong place.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. And I certainly can see a cultural shift from folks who you take someone who's traditionally been doing this, maybe they've had a long history in supply chain and they're very good at what they do in terms of a planning perspective. But because they've had such a long history, at some point in time, they're going to decide it's time to retire. And all of that experience kind of goes with them when they walk out the door. And so the planning systems that are put in place no longer can rely on that gut feel or the experience of a person or personnel. It really does have to be based on the data, which then changes the roles of how these planners look at themselves and what they're doing to be able to manage the systems rather than give the gut feel for the planning themselves, right?
Absolutely. And I'm going to talk about one example, Michael. So we are working on one of the planning system implementations for one of the largest bottling consumer goods company out of Ireland. And it's interesting when I was talking to them, the client actually, which is a supply chain officer, actually told me that I have a problem. The whole bunch of guys that actually were using the whole system are all retiring almost at the same time. It's funny when he said that because I felt like it's almost like they all grew up in that system in their plant, building the planning systems. And they never thought about the fact that the core set of guys are all going to also retire at the same time. They're at a place where they're saying, okay, we're going to not have these great planners that actually ran our company for the last many years, and they're all going to go away in the next 2 years. How do I really get this new system in place and how do I really onboard? And I think yet again, it tells us that with all the technology, the role of humans and peoples are not going to go away. It is an important aspect that you always have to look at the humans and machines as a joint solution. Thinking about this concept of humans and machines together is very fundamental. But I feel that the capability of what today's planning system can do or could do, if you were to build them up completely ground up, is so far powerful in that way, although it is trying to solve different set of challenges as well. The macro issues, the challenges when you operated in a flat world, and I call in a world where we are going, which is a deglobalization in some form, and call the rebalancing of supply chain. I call it the deglobalization, but in essence, you're no longer going to want to operate in a flat world, in as flat as the way it was. Right? So the world is flat notion worked very well for us and served our purpose for a very long period of time. But it's very clear that the deglobalization in its own form is going to be more than going forward. So if you're going in that form, you need the planning systems that operate in this disconnected but supposedly cooperated world. Think of it that way. But they're all having their own minds and decision making powers. But the whole world is trying to operate as one seemingly simple world to solve and bring, I call, the products and services in front of the consumers, right? So I think in that conversation, I couldn't agree more. I feel the organizations do lead with cultural human transitions, and human transitions are not to be forgetting about the fact that while AI transition is happening, it's almost impossible for any organization to either be a leader or a fast follower without having the human transitions leading their organizations. Very important in that context. It addresses
Yep.
issues of skill gaps. You talked about skill gaps and challenges with people and smart port planners retiring. I look at these statistics and try to understand that more than almost close to two-thirds of CEOs talk about disrupted supply chains in their earnings calls. You go to a campus, talk to the fresh graduates, we find less than 10% talking about supply chain. So you have this almost a disconnect that the CEOs of some of the largest corporations are talking about the real problems in their world, which is supply chain. And then you have the kids coming off the graduate schools not really talking about it. So how do you really bridge this gap of the notion that here is a problem, we need the young and brightest and smartest kids to actually talk about their problem and help and take their help to really onboard it. And I think so that's one of the things that we are very obsessed and passionate about, where we are really now working with the universities alongside our customers and saying, hey, can we really drive this agenda of creating a significantly large talent base, and it has to start early in their careers and not late once they've already joined a corporate and then you start to really make them as supply chain experts. It doesn't work like that. You need college and kids when they're graduating to really feel excited and charged about trying to solve this big real world problems in that way. So I see a little bit of disconnects on how many CEOs talk about it, but very little or very few of the kids actually talk about supply chain. So how do you really solve this? That's where we are stuck in the middle, because people who are supply chain players and we're all in that industry, we know how to solve it, but we just have a huge talent gap to fill.
But it really sounds like we need to be moving towards more. You mentioned autonomous earlier, where we have
Yes.
more automation supporting the data transfers, the validations, the execution angle of it to support the supply chain as a whole within the organization, and then interacting with other autonomous or automated supply chains at other organizations to support that kind of broader view of it all. And I think maybe that's part of the challenge is really rethinking what kind of talent you need to support those new supply chains because it may not be the same kind of talent that you had in the past. Your folks in the past needed to be trained on some of the planning. These are more systems related stuff. It sounds like we absolutely need to have some automation to support the supply chain as a whole because we're not necessarily going to get all those kind of resources back again.
I think that you really touched an important point in that, Michael, that, you know, the roles of the future on what you're going to be needing in the supply chain organizations are very different than what we needed in the past. You need real data scientists, you need cloud architects, you need business problem solvers. So there are things that remain the same. I think the core aspects of SNOP and thinking about how you really solve your supplier ecosystem remains the same. Where you source from will change, but generally speaking, you're looking only at alternate strategies, but essentially, you know that there are real advantages of some things being only available in some places because of weather reasons and stuff like that. You can always see that, hey, this product is best built in this country or this geography, right? So some of them will remain the same, but trying to get those things into your consumer's hand, you need data scientists. You really need the technology evangelists to really be able to solve this. Autonomous is a fantastically ambitious goal for people to reach and chase. But I think it needs a fairly methodical way to transition to that because you start to really take one part of your organization and just completely make it autonomous. It gets very hard. When it gets really, very hard, I think this people need this transition steps before they can actually fully adopt that and feel that, hey, that's my new way of doing things. You call, this example of you had a blockbuster which was selling the videotapes. And then you had an ultimate world today where there's proliferation of on-demand OT apps. But people don't realize that you had a lot of in-between delivery models. Like you had CDs available on rent and home deliveries of those movies that were coming home. So you had a bit of a transition path. And I think if you think about it for us, it's almost very similar in the supply chain world because you almost have to say that, how do I start adopting all that is available in AI? Because there's a lot that's available today. You're going to get a different set of issues to really solve when you actually have a fully autonomous supply chain working, right? Because you constantly have to really feed your ecosystem with the right set of suppliers, right alternate strategies, and so forth. So I feel while you address people and talent shortages and that gap, but the roles itself are very different. So I feel like my guidance always to my large clients is that, hey, first start thinking about the human transitions and what are the archetypes role that are very fundamental to build the supply chain solutions of the future. Once you start there, then I think you can very progressively start to think about taking those systems and have a longer term mindset on the ecosystems. Don't solve it just for your suppliers, solve it for the ecosystem, because the more you solve it for the ecosystem, the more smarter your organization becomes, how they really respond and close on.
So you mentioned larger companies. How does a smaller organization get started on their journey to incorporate AI and ML into their supply chain processes?
Yeah, I think that you look this point about this smaller versus larger organizations, right? Look, 80%, 70% actually statistically small businesses genuinely believe that technology is there to help solve their small business problems, small or medium businesses. So there is an acceptance of sort that they fully understand the role of technology in making their business either be more innovative or even simply put, be more efficient, right? So you work on these two dimensions and say how much you innovate in your business model versus how much you simply be more efficient. And I think there's value in both from technology. What technology can do to change the way you do your business and the technology you use to the way you run your business. It's two different things, right? So I think for smaller businesses, the real challenge is prioritizing this. In the last 2 years, the madness of demand, infinite demand flow, really gave them no time to breathe. Clearly, most of our medium-sized clients struggle to give any attention to what they had to do inside. So it's almost like they were caught completely off guard with this burst of demand that were flowing in. They were trying to really find a way to capture as much as possible, but in a mad way, I would say, because it just burned a lot of cycles of them, right? One of the clients gave me a very interesting narrative and why they believe genuinely that supply chain technology investments are their number one priorities. He said, what happened in COVID is everybody went through a shutdown and that killed the whole demand. And then at twice the speed, the whole demand came bouncing back. And almost every organization really struggled with what they called a disrupted supply chain, right? Now, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the market with inflations, interest rates, recession, the reviews of that. But I think this client told me that we want to be just about hopeful that maybe the recession will be a shallow recession. So if it is shallow, then I don't want, again, supply chain to be broken when I come back. So let's say you do go into a down cycle, but he is thinking about the coming back cycle already. And so he's saying, I don't want to come back with broken supply chain. And hence, I want to constantly stay close, investing in supply chain and leverage AI to that. The access of AI, the idea of a SaaS, the idea of a cloud-based services provider actually makes it very easy for mid-market companies and small companies to use because they no longer have to buy perpetual licenses and big capital commitments to build a big IT organizations, right? CIO organization continue to shrink in that form because access through the cloud and the virtual world is more easy, which means a small business actually has the same opportunity to access that AI tool that a large Fortune 100 has access to. There's actually no difference, which is the power of technology to really be disruptive in your business model. I think is fantastic opportunity for all of them.
I agree. It certainly levels the playing field. Absolutely. Last question for you. If I were to sneak into your bedroom and look at your nightstand, what book would I see there?
Oh, so I am right now reading a couple of things. I'm reading a little bit of a macro book because I feel I would rather like to be more prepared with the uncertainties. We know in our world, uncertainties are going to be the new normal. And so I'm reading this book on an author who was the prime minister of Australia, is one of the guys who's been the closest with China. And so it's called Avoidable Conflict. And I'm reading that saying, what would happen or what are the ways possibly a US-China meltdown can be good for the world. Like you want to avoid that as to what that means and so forth. So I'm reading a little bit completely unrelated to supply chain, but something again ties back to try to look for what's problem that are likely to come. And so how do you deal with it?
Yeah, actually, it probably is more closely related to supply chain you think, given the fact that our world is so globalized and the trade relation between China and the United States is pretty strong in terms of its requirements both ways. Nirav, I really appreciate you joining. I want to thank you again for being on our podcast and sharing a lot of these really good insights about supply chain and leveraging AI and automation to really upscale and upskill your people to deliver for your organization. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. Thank you for having me today, and I really enjoyed the discussions. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. And to make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you've heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how SS&C Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.